Your brain initiates muscle movement milliseconds before you consciously decide to act, creating a pure illusion of control. In this case study, a logistics patriarch engineered that exact neurological trick to bypass his heirs.
My name is Elena.
For 15 years, I operated under the assumption that I was the architect of my own future, and the designated successor to Vance Freight Solutions. Names and specific identifying markers in this case study have been changed for privacy, but the documentary record, the legal filings, and the financial timelines remain entirely intact. This is the story of a family enterprise, and how a single, quietly executed trust document systematically rewrote 3 generations of succession planning without a single raised voice or overt confrontation. To understand the architecture of this transition, we have to look at the operational reality of Vance Freight prior to October of 2023.
My father founded the company in 1998.
By the time I joined as Vice President of Operations in 2012, it was a mid-sized logistics firm running a fleet of 300 Peterbilt trucks, primarily servicing the I-95 corridor and managing a massive cross-docking facility in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
My father was a meticulous operator.
He managed by spreadsheet and silence. He rarely gave verbal praise, but he delegated operational authority to me in very concrete ways.
By 2018, I was Chief Operating Officer.
I was approving capital expenditures over $2 million. I was negotiating our annual diesel fuel hedging contracts. During a strategic planning retreat in Aspen in November of 2018, he laid out the succession timeline.
He was 62.
He told me he would step down as CEO at 65, transitioning to an advisory board role, and I would assume the executive chair. I spent the next 5 years preparing for that exact transition.
I restructured the middle management tiers.
I implemented a new warehouse management system that increased our cross-dock throughput by 18%.
I was building the engine I was promised I would eventually drive. Then came October 12, 2023. My father suffered a massive, fatal myocardial infarction in his home office.
He was 67, having delayed his retirement by 2 years to oversee the acquisition of a regional last-mile delivery competitor. The immediate aftermath was a blur of operational triage. I stepped into the CEO role on an interim basis, managing client relations and ensuring our supply chain partners that Vance Freight remained stable. It wasn't until November 3, 2023, exactly 22 days after his passing, that the administrative reality of the estate began to take shape. I sat down with our lead estate attorney and the firm's managing CPA to review the final tax filings and the corporate cap table. We were expecting a standard probate process. My father owned 51% of the company, my mother and my younger brother held the remaining 49% in a standard family limited partnership. The CPA slid a heavy binder across the table. He opened it to the final Schedule K-1 tax forms. I was scanning the line items, looking for the standard depreciation schedules, when my eyes caught a discrepancy on page 4. There was a line item for foreign trust distributions, tied to an IRS Form 3520A. I asked the CPA to explain the entry. He adjusted his glasses, looked at the attorney, and then looked at me. He explained that the entry corresponded to an irrevocable offshore trust, established a decade prior. The entity was called the Vanguard Ascendancy Trust. It was not registered in Delaware or Nevada. It was registered in the Cook Islands, a jurisdiction renowned for its impenetrable asset protection laws. In family business law, a standard succession plan relies on the gradual, transparent transfer of voting rights, usually structured through domestic holding companies to minimize estate taxes while keeping control within the bloodline. But an irrevocable offshore trust operates entirely outside domestic probate. It effectively creates a shadow capitalization table, invisible to standard internal audits. I asked the attorney to pull the corporate registry filings from the Secretary of State, going back 10 years. What we found over the next 4 hours was a masterclass in quiet, procedural reallocation. In 2013, the company's articles of incorporation had been quietly amended. The single class of common stock was split into two distinct classes, Class E, representing economic interest and dividend rights, and Class V, representing absolute voting control. My family still held the Class E shares. We were still receiving the financial benefits of the company's growth. But the Class V shares, the shares that dictated board appointments and executive authority, had been systematically transferred into the Vanguard Ascendancy Trust. Looking back at the corporate filings and board minutes from 2014 to 2018, there were three distinct anomalies that facilitated this transfer. A change in the registered agent for the holding company, a sudden shift in how dividend distributions were categorized in the ledger, and a new, unfamiliar signature on the commercial directors' and officers' insurance policies. Which of these red flags would you have caught first if you were reviewing the documents? Let me know in the comments, 1, 2, or 3. I didn't catch any of them. I was too busy running the daily operations, trusting that the administrative architecture was aligned with the verbal promises I had been given. The next step was identifying the trustee. The Cook Islands Trust deed named a protector and a trustee. The trustee was not a faceless corporate entity. It was an individual. Julian Croft. Julian was a former supply chain auditor who had joined our advisory board in 2012. He was quiet, analytical, and my father often praised his objective approach to risk management. I had always viewed him as a peripheral advisor. I now realized he was the legal architect of my displacement. Corporate governance relies heavily on the separation of equity and control. By splitting the economic interest from the voting rights, the trust retained the financial benefits for the family, ensuring we were well compensated, while transferring absolute operational control to an independent, non-family trustee. On January 18, 2024, I called an emergency meeting of the board of directors. I wanted to understand the mechanics of the trust and, more importantly, Julian's intentions regarding the CEO position. The meeting took place in the main conference room. The atmosphere was clinical. There was no anger, no dramatic confrontation. Just the cold, hard reality of corporate bylaws. I asked Julian to clarify the trust's mandate regarding executive leadership. He opened a slim folder, reviewed a single sheet of paper, and spoke in a measured, even tone. He explained that the trust's primary fiduciary duty was the long-term preservation and professionalization of the enterprise. According to the trust's charter, upon the founder's passing, the trustee was mandated to initiate a national search for an external, professional CEO with experience scaling logistics networks past the $500 million revenue mark. I was not going to be the CEO. I asked him if this was my father's explicit wish. Julian replied that it was the structural mandate of the trust, which my father had signed and funded voluntarily over a 10-year period. My legal team spent the next 3 weeks analyzing the Cook Islands Trust deed, looking for a vulnerability. We looked for breaches of fiduciary duty, lack of capacity, or undue influence. The trust was bulletproof. It contained a standard spendthrift clause, preventing creditors or heirs from attaching the assets. More importantly, it contained an anti-duress provision, often called a flee clause. If any beneficiary initiated litigation against the trustee, the trust would automatically sever that beneficiary's economic interest and relocate the jurisdiction to another offshore haven. Suing Julian would not just fail, it would bankrupt my family's income stream. The legal reality was absolute. We had operational history, we had the verbal promises, and we had the economic shares. But we did not have the votes. By March of 2024, the transition was complete. The board, controlled by Julian's voting shares, appointed an external CEO from a major national freight conglomerate. I was offered a choice. I could remain as chief operating officer, reporting to the new CEO, or I could resign and retain my Class E economic shares, continuing to receive my quarterly dividend distributions. The tangible decision was straightforward, even if the emotional reality was not. I could not stay and watch someone else drive the engine I had spent a decade building, knowing the keys had been taken from me before the race even started.
I submitted my resignation on April 2, 2024.
In the aftermath, I had to rebuild my professional identity outside the shadow of the Vance name. I took my accumulated savings and invested in a smaller, regional tech logistics startup, taking a minority equity stake and an advisory role. It was a fraction of the scale, but the governance structure was transparent. The lessons I extracted from this case study extend far beyond corporate law. They touch on the fundamental nature of trust and the systems we build to protect ourselves from our own biases. I trusted the narrative of succession because it aligned with my daily reality. I was doing the work of a CEO, therefore I assumed I was the CEO in waiting. I failed to recognize that operational authority is not the same as structural control. My father was a man who valued the entity of the company above the emotional comfort of his lineage. He believed, perhaps correctly, that the business required a different type of leadership to survive the next decade. But rather than having a difficult, honest conversation with his daughter, he chose to engineer a silent, procedural end run. He gave me the illusion of control, allowing my brain to initiate the movements of leadership, while he held the actual reins in a jurisdiction 8,000 miles away. The final document I received from the estate attorney was not a financial record. It was a personal letter, found in my father's safety deposit box, dated exactly 10 years before his death, addressed to Julian Croft. It contained only 3 sentences. The business must outlive the family. Elena has the engine, but she lacks the brakes. Execute the transfer quietly, and let her believe she is driving until the road runs out. The road ran out on October 12th. And I am still trying to understand who was actually in the car.